Good morning, everybody. On behalf of Impossible Metals, welcome to today's webinar, The Geopolitical Impacts of Critical Minerals. I'm really honored to be joined by the Honorable Frank Fannon. He's the CEO of the Fannon Global Advisories and former US Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources. Frank has been at the forefront of global energy sector and critical minerals policy. Actually, last Tuesday, just this week, he testified on breaking China's chokehold on critical mineral supply chains to the US House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs. So we're really lucky to have him share his wisdom with us today, hot off that experience, which you can also find on YouTube. If you have questions for Frank, we'd ask you to raise your hand, which is the little hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them after some opening questions. And I want to remind everybody, as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted next week. So welcome, Frank. Super excited to have you here. Thank you for joining.
It's my delight to join. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I thought we would start by kind of setting the geopolitical context. So I think people are familiar, but China now has a real dominance over critical minerals, depending on which minerals, 60 to 90% they control. And how does this impact America's national security, economic resilience?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's it absolutely transforms the psychology of a country to be dependent on another, in particular an adversarial one, on anything. And China has built up this industrial capacity as a part of the state-driven model. It's a strategy focused on control and influence, not a strategy focused on pretty much anything else. And they've been remarkably successful at doing so. Of course, they did it because they were successful in part because the US and Europe chose to basically offshore big industrial processes and industries that were perceived as heavy or dirty. So the US certainly has been complicit over several years, as well as most of the leading economies of the world.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, I was really interested in your testimony. You described China's strategy as a quiet war fought with minerals rather than missiles. Can you elaborate a bit more on what that means and what are they doing?
Yeah, sure. So, for multiple years, we have witnessed, our US intelligence agencies have publicly reported how China's economic model, their predatory debt diplomacy approach, and their control of supply chains, their blatant theft of intellectual property, and their economic and corporate-based espionage are all existential threats to the United States. They seek to really control this supply chain in a way, and it struck me, why have we had multiple public reporting by the FBI? I mean, you can go to the FBI China threat webpage. I mean, this has been very, very well documented. Why has America not taken the right, appropriate response if this is such a meaningful a threat to the homeland and our way of life? And what struck me was one of the reasons why is because we have an asymmetrical concept of war. The U.S., like much of the West, still views war in the lens of Clausewitz's famous On War, wherein war is defined as the use of force to compel an adversary to shape to your political will. It's a kinetic action, whereas China rejects that entirely. They ascribe to their homegrown philosopher, not the West, Sun Tzu, who builds the entire strategy, the concept of war is to actually win without ever fighting, and to attack the enemy's strategy. So what we see in the case of critical minerals is we have this change of the makeup of and the modernization of the U.S. economy, which is incredibly minerals intensive. And what they're effectively have done have been waging this quiet war, as I described, to deny the ability of America to ever have the capability to wage a kinetic one, should that ever arise. So that's what I mean by the war, by the quiet war. That's what I mean why that's the only reasonable conclusion that I've been able to come up with as to why America, when all the warning signs across administrations have been very clear, why a U.S. has not taken the appropriate level of countermeasures. I think that's changed now. I think it's important to note. I think that's very much that's very much the current thinking of the Trump administration, and that also that consistency of the mission is absolutely clear, because that informs the strategies and tactics that would be deployed as appropriate level of countermeasures.
Yeah, that's great. Can you elaborate a little bit on the policies that China is using? Things around dumping and restrictions and lower cost of capital. Just what are the toolbox that they use against critical mineral supplies from the West?
Yeah. So the first, I would go back to, when did this all start? We can look at the strategy started, with the Chinese that we were public about, when Deng Xiaoping, then Chinese leader in 1987, said the Middle East has oil, we have rare earths. And so he developed an entire industrial capacity to dominate that supply chain. So that was really when the offshoring really started. It was meaningful, purposeful action. Then we saw in 2010, when they did have a pretty dominant share, China and Japan got into a battle over, or a dispute over a maritime issue over fisheries. And in response, China banned the export of rare earths to Japan. The U.S. joined in condemning that action, and there was a broader ban. Prices went up of rare earths 350%. And at the time, President Obama initiated a WTO challenge against China with Japan and the European Union. It took about 2 years for that WTO challenge to go through the process, and they found that China, of course, was in violation of trade rules. In that intervening period, China switched its policy. Rather than banning the export, they dumped rare earths on the market and depressed prices to such a significant level that it was one of the main drivers that took the one U.S. rare earth mine into bankruptcy. So in that one example, in 2010, is the playbook that China has consistently deployed, refined, many, many times over. And just the threat of China dumping or asserting pricing power. Again, the media focuses a lot appropriately on the banning or restrictions of exports, but their real power is the ability to dump, to undermine the economic case for a Western investor to ever develop any semblance of competition. And I would say about a year and a half ago, Xi Jinping just asserted he was concerned about cobalt prices. And 2 weeks later, the one cobalt development in the United States announced that they were going into care and maintenance because the price just dropped, and financing was impossible. So this is their power, is both on the banning, the restrictions, as well as the dumping. And then they were able to be competitive because they're not into it to realize financial returns like a Western investor are, and because of our capital markets, they're entities and instrumentalities of the state. And it doesn't matter. I mean, the China Stanford Center actually looked into the question, well, what is the degree of SOEs, state-owned enterprises in China, versus the private sector? And they concluded that there's an increasing blending of both. And it's just all gray. So the presumption is the state's involved somewhere. And China's, it's not just in the production, the refining, but again, I go back to that pricing power as the world's largest purchaser of many of these commodities. And that has a meaningful effect on, what is the price on any of these minerals, and how do we source them?
Yeah, I mean, the example you bring up about the cobalt market is very, very relevant. It's very recent, and we see the dumping and the price coming down. But the question is, how should the US respond to this price manipulation by China?
Yeah, well, I think the Biden administration had an approach, which is, and this goes back to I go back to my kind of high level principles of whenever a government comes to power, they have to have an organizing principle. What is the North Star that's guiding the government? The Trump administration, it's security. It was in the Trump administration which I served, and it certainly is today. The Biden administration changed that. The Biden-Harris administration elevated climate change as the existential threat that should guide U.S. foreign policy. And as a result of that, it compromised the ability to really take on China. And why is that? It's because China is the biggest producer of not just and refiner and marketer of critical minerals, but also in manufacturing of clean energy technologies. So there was a bit of a perverse outcome. Although they recognized the security imperative, they also had a call to really accelerate the deployment of clean energy technologies fast and cheaply as possible. That requires some accommodation with China. The Inflation Reduction Act was a meaningful demand catalyst to spur domestic clean energy manufacturing, gigafactories, et cetera. But it actually didn't have a supply response as well. So you increase the demand for something for which we lack the inputs, and that China is the dominant producer of those inputs. It actually has the potential to increase the problem. The other point that the Biden approach was to subsidize or incentivize everything, which was which is well intentioned, and it did stimulate considerable activity, but it did not. It was all a carrots approach. There were no sticks, and that was a real problem. President Reagan famously said, "If you want more of something, subsidize it, and if you want less of it, tax it." There was not the approach on taxes. The Trump administration, the word tariff is the greatest word in the English language, according to the president, and they're deploying tariffs a lot. So that's kind of one way to have the stick, rather than ask the U.S. taxpayer to come down to the Chinese level, which is hard to see. We should also, although we should support it, we should also make the Chinese pay more to create that levelized playing field. So I would say the Trump response is both. It's a holistic approach that's doing both, and also deploying real capital.
Yeah, talking about capital that the Trump administration is deploying. I mean, we recently heard about a big investment into MP Minerals and setting a floor. I wonder if you could kind of outline some of the funding mechanisms that are at the disposal of the US government, things like DFC, Exif Bank, DPA, OSE, etc.
Yeah, there's lots of buckets of money. Those are all quite relevant. Some of them provide just debt. So the Export-Import Bank was initially something that was focused. I mean, these organizations are also going through change. I would say in my testimony, I talked about the importance of right sizing and modernizing our finance tools to support these industries. The Export-Import Bank was really created to help U.S. content being exported to other countries around the world. If you're going to build a mine, in that instance, we should have a U.S. engineering firm do the design, and we should have a U.S. Tractor company send the kit overseas. And so the U.S. government and the EXIM Bank would help finance that in the form of debt. What they've done now is there's a program called the China Transformational Exports Program, or CTEP, which seeks to increase and create greater flexibilities for U.S. business, where there's certain strategic industries, of which critical minerals is one. So they're changing and making calling for greater flexibility for those programs. So this is all in flux right now. The International Development Finance Corporation is an entity that can actually make it's rare, it's unique because it can make equity level investments in projects overseas, as well as provide debt, as well as provide political risk insurance. What we see, though, is it's been underutilized. And then there's different scoring issues that make it complicated to issue in equity. The DFC is going through a current reauthorization through Congress, so I expect that to change and probably it'll be modernized as well to have greater flexibility. Also increase the ability authorized level to finance these projects. And the XM is going to go through the same reauthorization. So I would say these are critically important tools, but they're going to go through reforms, but it reforms in a positive way for this industry. The Defense Production Act is an emergency level kind of act that allows for the president to invoke and can move different pots of money and level to tap into defense related spending. And there's considerable amount of flexibilities in that. And then similarly, the Office of Strategic Capital, which is in the Defense Department, that's a relatively new entity, remarkably underutilized. It's only been, I think, in 2023 it was formed. It also is going through some reforms, but that is a debt level instrument. And then lastly, I would point out the Department of Energy they're going through some changes in terms of what and how they will be used, but they provide some grant money, they provide some loans as well. So there's a variety of financing tools available in the U.S. government, but it kind of depends on where is your project globally, what do you need, and then also it's important to note that there's typically some cost share. It's not just the U.S. government's just going to do it all. This is intended to be, especially under the Trump administration, catalytic capital to increase into to develop co-investments from other parties. This is a private sector led should be, and so the U.S. government investments are seeking to do that, as well as make strategic investments.
Yeah, that's a great overview of all of these complex acronyms that we're having to learn and how they coordinate. And as you said, some can only do debt, some can do equity, some have very, very high level restrictions on what they can do. So it's quite complex. Now, in your testimony, I think you also mentioned that off-taking should be something that should be leveraged by the government. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that. And how do you see strategic stockpiling being part of the solution?
Look, I think if the U.S. government is going to make an investment, I don't know why the U.S. government always just gives grants. What do we get out of that? Giving taxpayer money to benefit a private company. I think the U.S. government, if they're going to give money, they should get something for it, and there should be some kind of ROI. So I'd like to see. I think the U.S. should rather than just give money, they should get something, and get some kind of depending. I remember hearing people at the Department of Energy lauding their investment in Tesla during the Biden administration, and in talking about the Department of Energy's role in supporting the electric vehicles. Well, that's fine, but what if the U.S. government got a little piece of that Tesla instead of just giving them free money? It doesn't have to be a lot, but given the ramp up, that's a huge ROI for the taxpayer, and that also increases the probability and the public support. Again, this isn't the government's money, it's our money. So it increases the public support to actually do such grants and such investments. And that's what they should be, investments. So I think that is absolutely the right approach going forward. The U.S. government, the Trump administration is still pretty in the early stages. In terms of where they sit, and they're still working on getting political leadership across the interagency. They've done an amazing amount of work, but I would say there's a lot more to do.
Great. I want to remind you.
Stockpiles. You mentioned stockpiles. Look, I think stockpiles are important, but I don't think stockpiles are everything. the DoD has a stockpile that's remarkably underfunded. I was asked about it at my hearing, where I testified this week. The stockpile was remarkably underfunded. It's the concept. It's defense stockpile. It's based on an old concept. I mean, the question is, well, okay, you're going to have a stockpile. All right. Well, under what situation? What do you stockpile? How much? What are the scenarios that you should index to know if you're achieving your objective? It's an old objective. It's an objective based on the U.S. going to war, and then over how much we need to sustain that, and then to replenish it. And it's just not right sized. The U.S. has not been in war for some time, but we've become the armament to the world. So we've depleted our stockpile. All of that needs to be redone. I think I made the comment during my testimony. We need to think about not just the government stockpiling. We need the companies to stockpile. If they're the ones, the U.S. government is the single largest purchaser of oil in the world, the Defense Department, I mean. But the Defense Department's consumption is relatively immaterial compared to the overall U.S. economy, and everyone in the country driving. But in that instance, we have a strategic petroleum reserve that speaks to the entirety of the country. It's a different kind of a model. There's mechanisms that we can talk about doing that. But I think that that's something that, oil is relatively easy. When we start talking about critical minerals, it's a very complex thing. And you're talking about rocks as well as chemicals, and it just gets very, very complex. I think that's where the U.S. should partner with the private sector to kind of lead that.
Yeah, great. I want to remind people that we will be going to questions. We'll do them in the order. So please use the raise hand icon, and that will get you into the queue, which is the little hand icon at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about domestic mining. And, we've seen stats out there that it takes 29 years to permit a mine in the US. What realistic reforms can be done to reduce this?
Well, the administration has taken some pretty dramatic executive level reforms. Some of these were initiated during the first Trump administration, and they were making great progress. But of course, COVID happened, and everything kind of ground to a halt. So, building on that experience, the Trump administration, 47, as we say, 45 and 47, initiated a variety of executive orders to streamline permitting and particularly the federal review process. To rather than have something that goes years long, we should be able to make determinations in 28 days. It's fast, but it's certainly reasonable. It's only fast because we think of the 29 years you mentioned. 28 days seems, but if you go to what is happening in the market is you see a price differential on U.S. mining projects, or valuation differential, if there is a project on private land versus one in which there is a federal nexus. Now, you don't need to have a greater indictment of the way the U.S. federal permitting system works than that. People don't want to invest in mines or match resource development if there's a federal nexus. So how do we catalyze it? How do we change it? We have to address it. The administration is making executive orders. Congress but really some of this is going to be legal, or is require legislation. And that requires some consideration both mostly on the left, but also on the right in terms of asserting things like eminent domain and things that are antithetical to traditional kind of conservative approaches in terms of federalism, states' rights. But we have to get there. So what I like to say is we don't have a lack of resources in the United States. What we tend to have is a lack of political will. And I think that is changing. President Trump's can't run aground. They're moving forward with a variety of initiatives. The extent to which it's a matter of can Congress come along? I do think that there are glimmers of hope there. but time is short. But I think the other point I made is it's important for Congress, and I suggested this during my testimony, that Congress raise the alarm of what's happening, and both on the security side, but also to expose the way the Chinese invest and the way they develop their mining resources and their refining resources. I had the ranking member Bear asked me the question. He said, "Well, they were able to." He's from California, where they've suffered horrendous forest fires. You know something about that? And he said, "Well, they were able to pass, legislation to address forest fires, and on a bipartisan basis." And I said, that right there is the example. I said, you were able to pass that because bipartisan. You literally had flames licking at your doorstep. That created a sense of emergency, and it made something that seemed far away. It was literally on your doorstep. It became very real. We need to have that same kind of urgency to explain to the American people why they need to have mining domestically and processing domestically, or otherwise they're just not going to have the sense of urgency. The other point I made is, especially for the more progressive-minded interests, to expose the Chinese approach. The Department of Labor issued a report on forced and child labor. They issue this every 1 or 2 years. And there's a section in there, this was during the Biden administration, there's a section in there that says how the green energy transition is at risk of undermining human rights and values or something along those lines. And specifically, they named Chinese companies who are perpetrating this. And the last thing I said is I said that the Congress has taken action in this space on human rights in the context of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which created a rebuttable presumption that something being produced in the Xinjiang region, the Uyghur region of China, was tainted by human rights abuse. And it shifted the presumption to the exporter from that region to demonstrate that they're not tainted. And it has had I would say it's had a mixed result. And part of that is other countries need to join in that effort. But so my point is to move away from the academic theoretical exercises and point to specific examples where there has been bipartisanship and there has been a human rights centered policy.
Yeah, that labor report, you actually directed me to it, and we did a blog post. I was remarkably surprised how the mainstream media did not pick it up at all. This is last year in the Biden administration. We do have a blog post. Maybe Holly can find it and put it on the chat. But I think it's shocking to see what's going on. So we'll do one more question and then I'll go to the audience. So this question is, around the permitting, we saw the Department of the Interior initiate the process to lease seabed minerals around the U.S. territory of American Samoa. What's your view on that initiative from the administration?
I think that was also following an executive order calling for it. So, which is the executive order comes from the executive, that's President Trump. So I think that is a considerable statement, and it is it's a remarkable advancement. Again, they're not sitting around waiting and let's debate and discuss. Let's just go forward and take action. I think it's completely consistent with the earlier executive orders on developing domestic mining. The U.S. government, and also not just domestic mining, domestic oil and gas. Whether that oil and gas is in on federal lands in the state of Wyoming, or if it's in federal waters in the Gulf of America. These are the American citizens' resources to develop, and we should look into developing them. So I think it's a consistency here, which is important. If we have resources on land, we should develop them. If we have resources in the water, we should develop them, and they're going to be developed in a way that aligns with our values, as we talked about the human rights, and our environmental standards. And we should absolutely take a look at all of that.
Great. Okay, let's go. I think the first person with the hand up is Tom. If anyone else wants to ask questions, please use the raise hand icon. So Tom LaTorrent, over to you. Please unmute and ask your question.
Oh, great. I had no idea I was first. So Frank, you talked about tariffs versus funding things. And I think the tariffs were long overdue, but at the same time, the Trump administration's been undoing some of the carrots. And I'm wondering why, and I just sort of jotted down a list of production tax credits, grants, loans, loan guarantees, price floors, offtake agreements / stockpiles, and permitting reform, and I'm sure there are others. What is the right balance of that sort of stuff? Which ones are the best? Do you want a little bit of all of them? Is there a certain one that we really should be targeting? What's the calculus for balancing those things?
It's tough.
Thank you.
I mean, thank you for the question. It's a tough question because what we're talking about is an enormous challenge. And the Chinese are able to vertically integrate things. They can take a loss leader on refining, but they make up money on economies of scale of mining and manufacturing. We don't have vertically integration. These are separate industries. Mining's one thing, refining's another thing, manufacturing and forging, technology. These are all different segmented industries in the United States. We're not going to vertically integrate. So how do we connect all of these? One of the ways to do that is through capital formation and deployment. So how do we knit these things up? It's a huge challenge. I think if security is, founding principles, Tom, what is our organizing principle here? If our organizing principle is security, then, and what does that mean? That means that we have to maintain our own means of production to run our economy. And we have to it doesn't mean you have to be everything domestic, but we have to have a sense of security and control over it. So what we don't want to do is accelerate demand side policies, which the IRA by and large, I just think it just moved forward it accelerated the consumption and uptake of certain things faster than the market was ready to bear. It just moved that forward on the curve. But what it did is it didn't have a corresponding supply. So I would say that the Biden administration approach, one would say, well, I'm biased, I'm a Republican, true. But I would say that the Biden administration approach had the potential to increase our minerals dependency because it wasn't right size for the supply. Second, the market didn't seem to be favoring a lot of some of the policies, and it kind of yielded perverse outcomes. The inclusion of allowing China to continue to provide material into the U.S. and for also, it's important, none of this is, the IRA wasn't prohibited. You had the tax credits, incentives, but it wasn't prohibiting Chinese from coming into the market. All of that was whether and to what extent the U.S. taxpayer was going to subsidize it. And if security is your mainstay, subsidizing your adversary seems like a foolish thing to do. Should we subsidize U.S. industry and those of allies and partners? I think that's the approach right now. I think that's what we're seeing. Is that the right mix? Is that the right balance? I don't know. I don't think anyone does. But what is it informed by? And I would say it's informed by the security objective.
Great, thank you. Lars L, please unmute and ask.
Yeah, just a question, because you mentioned that a lot of the measures, they are implemented through executive orders, or however you call it. But this is really dependent on the executive. Does this actually provide the time horizon you need for those kinds of infrastructure projects, as you're talking about in mining?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a real pacing challenge. Oliver mentioned the 29 years to build a mine. I mean, I mean, I've seen others in 20 plus years in the United States or just in Western countries, I would say. That's a problem, but it only takes 3 to 5 years to build a manufacturing facility, gigafactory, refinery. The question is, how do we source material that aligns with our ability to have that domestic manufacturing and domestic control? Is that in the United States? Is that in other parts of the world? I mean, the Middle East is driving forward. They want to be this processing hub as well. I don't think the federal policy is necessarily going to dictate a lot of this being built out. A lot of this is going to be done at the state level, and a lot of it in why. What are the binding constraints? There are 3 on domestic side. It's capital. Is there money available for this? 2, can you get the permits? And that's where I noted the differential between federal and state. There are certain states, I mean, states like the state of Oklahoma, they want to build stuff. And the third, also relevant to Oklahoma, is power. Is power cheap or is it expensive? And so what you're going to see, and you saw this, is that a lot of the build out of these gigafactories tend to be in red states or Republican-led states. Why? Because they tend to have more favorable permitting and oftentimes cheaper energy costs. So I think that's kind of the way it's going to be. The pacing, is there enough time within I don't know. This is also one of the real challenges of having, as I mentioned, you had Trump 45 security, Biden changed its policy to climate change. Now we're back to security. Mines and developing these projects. Mines is going to be a 30-year time horizon, which is going to outlast the vagaries of anyone in the Oval Office. Business works on a different cycle than the political ones of 2 years and 4 years and 6 years, and then 8 years if you have 2 presidential runs. So it's choppy. That's why I go back to, it's not the U.S. government's role, and should never be, to subsidize projects, particularly marginal ones, to make them appear less so. The U.S. has to partner with companies and countries and projects that have meaningful, scaled economic projects right at the outset. The U.S. taxpayer shouldn't be the the swing on whether a project is good or not.
Great. Kevin B, please unmute and ask.
Yeah, hi, thanks. A couple of questions, really. One, you've talked about the sort of the conflict between supply and demand and address the supply side. I was just interested in your thoughts in terms of the potential to reduce demand. There's been a number of studies in recent years looking at the great potential there, and sort of reports by Bloomberg and others showing shifts away from technologies that aren't relying on critical minerals, such as for EV batteries. And the second question, in terms of if there is a conflict with supply, some of the key metals from deep sea resources are nickel and cobalt. And there, for nickel, China, looking at US Geological Society figures, China's mine production was actually 3%, even though it dominates, along with Indonesia, supply. And for cobalt, it's not even listed. So for some of the key metals from deep sea reserves, it seems that China, although it has a big issue in terms of production, isn't a big issue in terms of extraction. And therefore, is the issue more to do with production, and it's not actually to do with the need for accessing new extraction sources?
Great, thanks. I'll take the first one, the idea of thrifting or less minerals intensity in various technological applications, and that way we won't have the supply crunch. I've seen that, but the reality is our demand will just shift to another industry. So yes, copper intensity has dropped significantly in electric vehicle battery packs, but it's increasing in other applications. We're now talking about this new industrial revolution with AI, data centers. So the copper intensity may have reduced some degree in electric vehicles, but it's exponentially greater in others. Cobalt, Tesla has done a good job in reducing cobalt intensity too, because it's harder to get, or nickel. It's a complex thing. I don't think it's going to have a material effect because our demand is going to continue to outpace whatever thrifting potential we have. Related to that would be recycling and reuse. That's another area where some argue, well, we don't need as much as we say because we can recycle and reuse. Again, you need a foundation from which to recycle, and we're just in the early stages of that ramp up. Again, the economy is changing pretty materially. The other question was also, what was it? Was it on supply? What was that?
It was about the sort of the influence of China, really, and the fact that China's mining for nickel is very low. For cobalt is almost it's extremely low.
Yeah.
And therefore, do we really need more supply or more production?
Yeah, fair. So I contest some of these charts that we see, by the way, that simply look at, I think they're too simplistic. That look at the bar charts, you'll see the bar chart of production or mines, and China will be red, right? And it'll be relatively modest. And then they go to the next bar chart, and it's refining, and it's like really big, it's like 90% or whatever, depending. What the problem is that these charts are simplistic in that they simply focus on, where the activity is occurring. They're not focused on who controls it. Yeah. So Indonesia is a great example. Okay, so in that instance, you've got Indonesia, and then you have Russia, and then nickels for nickel, and China's nowhere to be found. And so everyone focuses on the refining. Yeah, but China controls all of Indonesia, practically all of Indonesia's nickel production. So even if some of the countries have been cautious about allowing Chinese companies to own outright mines, but the Chinese are the largest market. So what you see is, if the Chinese might not own the mine outright, they probably are a significant investor in the project and likely have marketing rights for 100% of the production, all the volumes. So those bar charts, I think, are overly simplistic. I think there's more work to be done. I think that work is undergoing right now to have a greater picture to understand their control. China seems to be, there's been the last week and this week, the FT had stories on how China's snatching up more mines. In my testimony, I give a figure that in 2023, China's Belt and Road mining investments increased 158% over 2022 levels. The FT had a story this week on the same concept. So I don't think they're saying they don't need the supply. They're snatching it up. And maybe and it's interesting that they're snatching it up, because usually commodities investments tend to correlate closely with economic, the state of the economy, and the economy in China is, by all accounts, seem to be slowing, but their buying spree continues. So that's either because they need it, or they want to deny the United States the ability to get it.
And I would add that, it doesn't matter that the mines are not in China. As Frank said, it's who controls the mines, and the processing and the mine are intimately connected. If you look at Indonesia, they've banned the export of the ore. So you have to do the processing close to the mine. It's more economic to do the processing close to the mine, and that's all controlled by China. So this narrative that because there isn't Chinese mines isn't true. They control these mines in Africa and in Indonesia. Okay, let's go to Nanko E, please. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Hi, Frank. How, in your view, what are the main technological gaps or opportunities for U.S. firms, private firms, in this space? Especially when it comes to leading to international players, developing technologies domestically. I mean, and to mine the resources, deep sea
mining tech.
Mm.
So you're asking,
mean-
what is the technology opportunity?
No, no, yeah. I mean, how can we speed it up? Because the US is lagging behind the international, obviously, technologies that are available.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the U.S. is necessarily behind the technologies. I mean, we're here on Impossible Metals call.
No. I mean,
that's kind of suggests to me that the U.S. has something to contribute. And you know, I think the U.S. is behind in the deep sea more broadly, just by virtue of licenses and things like that. I don't think that's a technology question. I think that's just your stake in ground, and the U.S. hasn't done it. I think that's what's changing. I have absolutely every confidence in technology and the U.S. technology providers and innovators. The question is just the you know, the enabling environment and the market, and if there's an opportunity. And I think that the President Trump's executive orders and some of the recent actions has signaled that it's certainly an endorsement. And so I'm pretty confident. Is the U.S. behind? Yes, in terms of licenses and leases. Is the U.S. behind in technology? I don't believe so at all.
Paul H.
Thank you very much, Oliver and Frank. I just had a question. Since the Trump administration released the executive order to obviously fast track deep sea investments and deep sea mining and everything, it unilaterally bypassed, you know, obviously the International Seabed Authority, which is the prime agency for regulating international waters. Do you think that this was a right decision, obviously, for our nation and internationally, or should we have kind of just first been more a part of, you know, kind of implementing or kind of coming up with the mining code and then wait till the mining code was established and then obviously get more involved with the deep sea, you know, mining game? Or was that the right decision for us just to obviously unilaterally decide, well, we're going to start, you know, establishing permits to, you know, mine the deep ocean?
The U.S. has its own regulatory system to mine what it wants. And I don't think the U.S. should ever follow the United Nations on anything. Now, should we participate? Sure. Yeah. Part of the reason to participate in these organizations is because the Chinese tend to co-opt them. But that's a different thing than ceding U.S. authority to a body that is oftentimes averse to U.S. interests, and to those of many of our allies. So I think it's absolutely appropriate. It's completely within the rights of America to exercise authorities over its own jurisdiction. So I think that would be a problem if we didn't do so. And you know, that's the other question, is sitting around to wait for the UN to come up with rules. Like, why would we ever do that? We have the U.S. leads the best. We have the best, you know, offshore oil and gas rules in the world. The U.S. helped catalyze the entire deep sea oil industry. So I think the U.S. is a leader, not a follower in this regard, and I think we just need to maintain that.
Thank you.
Lawrence F.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Frank, for the excellent presentation. I'm located at Wasaga Beach near Collingwood. So I just wanted to ask you some questions from a Canadian perspective. Quick comments on the federal level. We have Bill C5, which allows for development, and our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, spent 2 days just recently with the Indigenous groups talking about their approval or disapproval of projects. And on a regional basis in Ontario, we have Bill 5, which is not C5, but it's 5, allowing for quick, rapid development. And my question would be not only resources in the ground, but Canada's been known as coast to coast to coast. with the East Coast, the West Coast, and the Arctic, which would involve seabed mining. So could you just perhaps comment a little bit on how Canada might fit into everything?
Yeah, well, I mean, Canada, I think, it has resources. It's a resource country. It has a long history. It's one of the real leaders in the way in which it's done. You mentioned the groups, some of the Aboriginal communities, some of the work, the alignment there. I think that's absolutely important. I think they also have been partners on a lot of the gas development, particularly out in BC, to help unlock some of that opportunity. So, I can't speak to the in terms of the deep sea context, and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the legislation you refer to, but I think that there could be tremendous opportunity. I just don't know what's available in the Canadian waters and things like that. But I think there would be a tremendous opportunity to work together. I also noted that Carney, which was an idea I floated some time ago, came out and suggested that Canada can start to finally make good on its NATO commitments by contributing minerals toward that, which I think is a novel approach. Could seabed play into that? Maybe. I don't know. I think what happened here is that President Trump, the way he's going about doing things and being clear and leading on this, is unlocking and forcing a new way of thinking in a lot of countries. And so I think the extent to which other countries could join in that, I think that would probably be welcomed.
Great. Harato L.
Thanks, Oliver. And thanks, Frank, for the time and thoughts as well. It's a similar question to Poe, actually. Setting aside the debate on the choice itself to open up a separate pathway, we're sort of keen to hear your thoughts on what it means for industry, especially if we're looking to, create a diversified, secure, but also stable and predictable critical mineral economy. And we're seeing some pretty divergent approaches globally and even in the West, right? That's my question.
I think it's, more is better, more options are better for security. I mean, Churchill famously said it's diversity, and diversity alone is the key to security. And so you want to have more sources and more optionality that creates a degree of redundancy. And where that is, and I don't know about if someone's upset about not wanting to source from deep sea in Western Europe, that's on them. I think a lot of countries in Western Europe have been rethinking their own energy policies pretty meaningfully. High prices tends to do that. So I don't think anything is set in stone. I think that there's been a recognition of security. The war in Ukraine has catalyzed that. I mean, when I was at the State Department, one of the other things I did is I led on energy sanctions, and I had many conversations with parties who continue to import Russian gas, and they would always say that Russia is a reliable supplier. Well, they weren't until they weren't. And why was Germany in this instance particularly averse to phasing down their reliance on Russia? Well, so much of their economy was built on manufacturing. Manufacturing is powered by gas, and the Russians were able to send them gas at very cheap prices. So it makes it politically challenging when you're dependent and your workers and your citizens, your voters are reliant on something for a long time. And it's, breaking up is hard to do. So you need to have greater diversity. And by the way, it's important to note that the US is far more reliant on some of these critical minerals in China than Germany was ever reliant on Russia. I mean, at their apex, OPEC only controlled about 45% of global oil, but we created an entire infrastructure to prevent the utilization of the quote unquote oil weapon ever again. So I think some of these countries that are slow to understand this, they're going to be in a difficult challenge. They face difficult situations later.
All right. Thanks.
Kieran, please, we've only got 5 minutes left, so if you could be brief, that would be great.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks, Frank, for the insightful comments. I had a question recently. The leaders of the 5 African nations, had a meeting in the White House, and the critical mineral was one of the topics there. And I was wondering what actually transpired out of that meeting. Anything concrete came out of that?
I think they had multiple I mean, it was a broader discussion than minerals, but minerals certainly came up, and there's an ambition to really it's building off of President Trump's broader kind of, I would say, minerals diplomacy approach, in terms of, Ukraine, for example, the critical minerals agreement there, critical minerals agreement with the Democratic Republic of Congo. These other countries, these 5 leaders, a lot of them weren't from minerals jurisdictions, but a few of them had some things and they wanted to explore. So, but I think it illustrated a lot of countries, including in Africa, want to see where they can participate in some of this. They see it as an economic opportunity. They see there is a real desire to work more with U.S. firms and U.S. investors and the U.S. government, and turn away from China's debt diplomacy model. So I think it's upside. The real work happens next when I think the Europeans, they announced do critical minerals in Europe in 2016. Nothing's really come of that. They recently, Trump announced it, and then they just had this meeting in Ukraine or in Europe about this Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, and it's so it's pulling these people together and mobilizing capital, and that's where you'll see the real outcomes. Still early days, but it's a good sign.
Yeah. Thank you.
Jim W.
Hi, Frank. So Secretary Rubio calls you up and brings you back into state and says he wants to put you in charge of critical minerals and BRICS. What would be your sort of top 3 policy recommendations for critical minerals in working with that group?
The BRICS?
Yeah.
Yeah. More broadly, rather than go into that, because that's an interesting grouping, I would say, first, we need to have a far more nuanced policy when we talk about countries. Just because a country aspires to work with us, where we have a historic relationship, or they're close, right? They're by virtue of geography or a free trade agreement, we need to have a far more nuanced approach to engagement. Number one. Why? Because a lot of these countries, Ursula von der Leyen came to Washington and wanted to have a benefit from the IRA. But when you have 30% roughly of the gigafactories in Europe are Chinese controlled, we're not going to subsidize, US taxpayers ought not subsidize that. So we have to have a more nuanced approach. Second, I also spoke in my testimony that we should have performance-based partnerships. What does that mean? Just because a country aspires something, but they're not willing to put skin in the game, we need to have a tiered level of engagement with those countries. We can work with them on other matters, but when it comes to this, I want to see the mobilization of their financing tools. If they don't have one, then develop one, and work with us to co-invest, deploy capital, and build stuff. We don't need to have more diplomatic convenings. I want to see the mobilization of capital, objective measures, and I want tons of material being moved. Thanks.
Last question, let's squeeze it in, Arlo H.
Yes, Frank, I just wanted some clarification on the answer that you gave to Paul about the Trump executive order. The Trump executive order actually opens 2 separate processes, one for domestic waters, which Impossible Metals has shown public interest in, the other for international waters. And you said that the U.S. should not be looking to the UN for everything. In terms of domestic waters, I completely agree with you. In international waters, that is the governance of the law of the sea that the U.S. receives a lot of benefits from its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone to its ability to claim extended continental shelf claim. Are you also referring to that part of the executive order when you say the U.S. should not be following the lead of the UN?
Well, the U.S. is not a member of UNCLOS. There's reasons for that. There are other legal theories that say that the U.S. can go in have under other legal authorities to go into those waters. I don't know the ins and outs of the legal theories, but I would defer to the U.S. government's interpretation rather than the group in Kingston who has yet to issue the actual rules. They're still talking about it. I don't think that the ratification of a treaty in the U.S. should stop the U.S. from looking and considering things. Thanks.
Okay, let's wrap there. Thank you so much, Frank, for your time. Really appreciate it. This has been wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and we will get this published next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.